Okay, let's jump right into something that really caught my attention recently. You had Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett,
Mm-hmm.
a Trump appointee of all people, seemingly pushing back pretty hard on the Trump administration's legal team in court.
Right.
It immediately raised a fundamental question for me, and probably for you listening too. What does this tell us about, the rule of law in action?
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is all about.
Yeah.
We're looking at those Supreme Court oral arguments, specifically around birthright citizenship. But the really compelling part, it's Justice Barrett's unexpected scrutiny,
Yeah.
especially coming from someone seen as a conservative voice.
Yeah. And to really get a handle on what went down, we've pulled together, a bunch of different perspectives. We've got stuff from Reddit's Raw, some Newsweek coverage, Law and Crime,
Right.
foundational context from usconstitution.net, some analysis from Fox News, even looked back at her confirmation hearings courtesy of the National Women's Law Center. Right. So our mission today is basically to navigate this kind of dense legal stuff and figure out what the crucial moments were. We want to understand why Justice Barrett's questions stood out so much.
Especially given who appointed her.
Exactly. And what it all might signal about, checks and balances in the U.S. system. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding a really important and frankly complex legal debate.
Okay, so the central legal question, the core of it, was whether a district court actually has the authority to issue a nationwide injunction.
Right, to block a presidential executive order.
Yeah.
In this case, the one about ending birthright citizenship. It sounds technical, I know, but the implications are huge for how things work.
They really are. And this is where Justice Barrett steps in. Remember, appointed by President Trump himself. But she starts hitting the Solicitor General, D. Sauer, that's the administration's lawyer, with some surprisingly tough questions.
And that fact that it's her asking these questions, that's what makes this whole thing so, noteworthy.
Definitely. So there was this key back and forth. It started actually with Justice Kagan, but Barrett picked it up. It was about how the administration deals with precedents set by the circuit courts.
Right, right. Barrett basically asked Sauer, look, does the government think it can just ignore a ruling from, say, the Second Circuit in New York simply because you guys don't agree with it?
And Sauer's answer? Well, he said the general practice is to respect those precedents, but, and this is the key word, it wasn't categorical.
That word general, you could almost feel the shift in the room, couldn't you? It seemed like it really raised Justice Barrett's eyebrows.
Totally. It's like saying, well, generally I follow the speed limit. It implies, well, sometimes you don't.
Exactly. And she sounded genuinely taken aback. She asked, is this administration's practice or the long-standing practice of the federal government?
And when Sauer insisted, it was the long-standing policy of the Department of Justice.
Her response was just, really? You could almost hear the skepticism.
Yeah. Sauer tried to explain, saying they generally respect circuit precedent, but not necessarily in every case, maybe if they're actively trying to overturn it. But Barrett, she wasn't letting him off the hook.
No way. She kept at it. She came up with a hypothetical. Okay, what if the Second Circuit this week, right now, says an executive order is unconstitutional? What happens tomorrow?
And Sauer's answer? Still hedging. Generally, we follow it.
Which just led Barrett to push back again very directly. So you're still saying generally, and you still think that it's generally the long-standing policy of the federal government to take that approach. She clearly wanted a more solid answer than that.
So what does this word generally really mean in this context? Well, it obviously suggests exceptions, possibilities where they might not follow a court ruling.
And Barrett was trying to pin down exactly what those exceptions look like. That hypothetical about a circuit court ruling right now. She wanted to know what happens in that immediate situation.
Precisely. And to underscore the importance of courts being followed, she brought up a really famous case, Cooper v. Aaron, from 1958.
Ah, yeah, the desegregation case.
That's the one. It basically established that states have to follow Supreme Court rulings, no ifs, ands, or buts. So Barrett asks Sauer, essentially, do you accept that principle for the Supreme Court, but maybe not for the circuit courts?
Which really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Does the executive branch see itself as bound by all federal courts or just the top one?
Exactly. Now, tied into all this was the whole issue of nationwide injunctions.
Okay, quick reminder for everyone. That's when a single judge can block something, like a rule or order, from applying anywhere in the whole country.
Right. And the Trump administration really didn't like them. They argued they caused chaos, that it's judges overstepping their bounds.
Makes sense. So how did Barrett engage with that?
Well, she kind of poked at their logic. She asked Sauer, Okay, what's the real practical difference between one of these nationwide injunctions and losing a big class action lawsuit?
Interesting angle.
Her point seemed to be, look, if a class action ruling binds everyone in the class, across different states potentially, why is a nationwide injunction that does something similar suddenly such a huge problem?
So what did Sauer say to that?
His response focused on how, in a class action, the losing side, the members of the class, are also legally bound by the judgment. It wasn't a super clear distinction, maybe, but that was his argument.
And it wasn't just Barrett asking these kinds of questions, was it?
No, Justice Kagan was on a similar track, really pressing Sauer on the practical side. Like, if a circuit court says your executive order is unconstitutional in this area, are you seriously going to keep enforcing it against other people right there in that same circuit?
So it felt like the justices, or at least some of them, were collectively worried about this idea. This idea that the White House could just pick and choose which court decisions it feels like following.
Right. Now, outside the courtroom, the reaction to Barrett's questioning was, well, it was pretty telling.
Yeah, what happened?
Some very vocal Trump supporters were definitely not happy. They saw her questioning, her challenging the administration's lawyer as, like, disloyalty. Not what they expected from her at all.
Wow. So, like, online commentary and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You saw comments flying around calling her a radical liberal, believe it or not. People saying her appointment was a huge mistake.
Seriously. Wow. That really shows you the expectation, doesn't it? That she just automatically side with the administration line.
It really does, which, frankly, makes her stance even more significant. You've got a conservative justice, someone appointed by Trump, openly challenging the executive branch on its respect for the courts.
So it suggests maybe a commitment to legal principles, to the separation of powers that goes beyond just partisan loyalty.
That's certainly one interpretation. Or, as some observers noted, maybe it's also about protecting the power and the legitimacy of the judiciary itself as a co-equal branch of government. She's defending the institution she's part of.
That's interesting. And thinking back, to her confirmation hearings, it adds another layer. I remember reading coverage, I think the National Women's Law Center highlighted this, that she often gave kind of vague answers back then.
Yeah, she deflected a bit on past precedents, her specific views on hot-button issues like healthcare, abortion. There was a sense that her overall judicial philosophy wasn't entirely pinned down.
Right. So compared to that, this questioning in the birthright citizenship case, it feels much more direct. Like we're getting a clearer picture of how she views the court's authority.
It does seem that way. And, this wasn't totally out of the blue either. Law and Crime pointed out another instance.
Oh, yeah.
Remember the Trump v. United States case about presidential immunity? Apparently, some of Justice Barrett's reasoning in that case was later cited in a ruling that went against Trump in his separate hush money case.
Huh. So it suggests maybe a pattern here of her applying legal reasoning independently, regardless of the political implications for the person who appointed her.
It certainly points in that direction. And adding one more voice here, Professor Jonathan Turley, you often see him on Fox News, writes for places like usconstitution.net.
Right, I know who you're hearing.
He basically suggested Barrett might be the greatest concern for the Trump administration in this particular case. He saw her as potentially being that key swing vote, deciding just how far judicial power can go in checking the executive.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. The big takeaway here seems to be Justice Barrett, Trump's own appointee, really grilling his administration's lawyer, specifically about this idea that they could generally decide when to follow court orders.
Yeah, this whole deep dive really throws a spotlight on that tension, that constant push and pull between the executive branch wanting to act and the judiciary's job to review those actions. It's checks and balances 101, but seeing it play out like this is fascinating.
And for you listening, hopefully this gives you a clearer picture of how that separation of powers actually works on the ground. It's not always predictable. Even justices you might think are solidly in one camp can push back based on, fundamental legal principles.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a pretty big thought to chew on, doesn't it? What does it actually say about the health of our system, our institutions, when a justice picked by a president feels the need to publicly challenge that same president's administration on whether it respects the courts?
Yeah.
Think about the long-term consequences. If the executive branch starts acting like court rulings are optional suggestions, what does that do to the balance of power down the road? Something definitely worth considering.